Introduction to the Gospel of John. As we get underway with our introduction to the Gospel of John, let's begin with looking at some similarities and differences between John and the Synoptics. There are some very interesting differences between John and the Synoptic Gospels. The language of kingdom that we found so regularly in the Synoptic Gospels is only found in two places in the Gospel of John. John 3, verses 3 and 5, and John chapter 18, verse 36. We introduced the Synoptic Gospels in Jesus' ministry in reference to the kingdom and saw that that was the essence of Jesus' preaching, and that what Jesus was basically doing was preaching a message that was about the return of Israel from exile and a return to the reign of God. And yet this language is hardly found at all represented in the Gospel of John. Instead of the focus being on the preaching of Jesus, as in the Synoptics, in John's Gospel, Jesus is the content of the preaching. Jesus himself is the revelation. Jesus typically teaches in parables in the Synoptic Gospels, but none are to be found in the Gospel of John. On occasion in the Synoptics, Jesus also casts out demons, and yet none of these are found in the Gospel of John. John 12:31 does say, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out," as Jesus draws his public ministry to a close. Another interesting feature of the Gospel of John is that the location of Jesus' ministry is in both Jerusalem and Galilee. And Jesus seems to go back and forth between Jerusalem and Galilee. And chapters 7:10 through chapter 20 takes place in Jerusalem. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem at the time of his passion, death, and resurrection. The arrangement is different in the Gospel of John, and while we can't talk a lot about this because there are so many different stories in the Gospel of John, it's remarkable that the temple cleansing is to be found in chapter 2 in John's Gospel. The temple cleansing is what really decides the fate of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels. And there is, in a way, a cloud that hangs over Jesus' entire ministry in the Gospel of John. So the temple cleansing right at the beginning puts the whole message in the perspective of Jesus is going to be opposed by the religious leaders. But the event that really clinches Jesus' death, that he would be arrested and put to death, in John's Gospel is the raising of Lazarus from the dead, a story that is only to be found in John's Gospel, John chapter 11. There's also, as I have intimated, quite different content in the Gospel of John. Different miracles told, for example, although there is some overlap, and we'll look at that shortly. There is also a different timing, it seems, for the crucifixion. The Synoptic Gospels present Jesus' Last Supper as a Passover meal, and yet in John's Gospel, John has Jesus put to death at the time that the lambs were slain for the Passover meal. Now, there have been different attempts to resolve this, yet it really does, on the face of it at least, seem to be a different timing. Both John and the Synoptics have Jesus dying at the Passover, and so the Passover is significant for interpreting his death, and yet the timing is presented differently. And then finally, Jesus' meal with the disciples focuses on foot washing in John chapter 13, not the Lord's Supper. In fact, the Lord's Supper is perhaps most clearly seen in John chapter 6, where Jesus says, "You must eat my body and drink my blood," to his disciples. There are, though, some similarities between John and the Synoptics. The temple cleansing that's at a different place is nevertheless to be found in all four Gospels. It can be said that one thing expected of the Messiah was that he would have something to do with the temple, a cleansing of the temple. The Qumran community would not have anything to do with the temple because they believed it needed to be cleansed. And the idea that the Messiah would come to reestablish the right worship of God in the land is something that is associated with temple cleansing too. There is also the story of the centurion's servant, or in John's Gospel, the royal official's son. That seems to be the same story. There is the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water in all the Gospels. There is Jesus' anointing at Bethany and Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. There is an interesting parallel between John and Luke, where after Jesus' resurrection, there's a miraculous catch of fish by some of his disciples that looks very much like Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, before Jesus' death, a miraculous catch of fish. And then in the Passion story itself, there is much that can be said about an overlap between what we read in the Synoptics and what we read in John's Gospel. Scholars have been divided as to whether or not John actually knew the Synoptic Gospels. And this has been a debate that has gone on ever since comments were first written down about it in the 2nd century A.D. So it's interesting to explore this idea. It seems as if some scholars recently have been pushing the idea that, yes, indeed, as was said by Clement Alexandria in the 2nd century, John did know the Synoptics, or at least one of them. And so he is not writing without an awareness of what had already been written. That comment by Clement of Alexandria, right at the end of the 2nd century, is this: "Last of all, John, perceiving that the external facts had been made plain in the gospel, being urged by friends and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel." This comes to us as something that Clement said through Eusebius, the church historian in the early 4th century. What can we say about the date of John's Gospel? Typically, scholarship has seen John's Gospel written very late. Indeed, the quote by Clement of Alexandria has suggested a later date in the 1st century. The suggestion has been made by John A.T. Robinson that John's Gospel is actually written fairly early, about the mid-century. And one of the big issues to consider here about the date is John's Gospel written before A.D. 70, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or afterwards? And we'll come to some of the discussion around that briefly. Let's begin, though, by looking at some of the external evidence. We have some interesting manuscripts that are very early, that are manuscripts recording words from John's Gospel. P52 has a few verses from John chapter 18 in it, and it is considered to be in the first part of the 2nd century and from Egypt. So a Gospel of John has been copied and made it to Egypt, or been copied in Egypt, in the first part of the 2nd century. How long would it have taken for the Gospel of John written in the context of Asia to have shown up in Egypt? Well, maybe it happened very quickly, but nevertheless, this is an early suggestion. This is an early dating for us of John's Gospel. It has to be before P52. There's also the Egerton Papyrus II, as it's called. It includes fragments of an apocryphal gospel that references John's Gospel, and it comes from the mid-2nd century. This also comes from Egypt. Then we have Justin Martyr, who is put to death perhaps in the 160s, and in his first apology written in the 150s, perhaps AD 155, there's a reference to John's Gospel. And then we have P66 and P72, which are also manuscripts of John's Gospel, parts of John's Gospel, that have the title, The Gospel According to John. So that is first found in toward the late 2nd century and the early 3rd century, at the time that Clement of Alexandria was writing. As we explore the date of John's Gospel, we should also look at the internal evidence. Now, some have suggested that this issue of the expulsion of Christians from the synagogue is also something that can be found in John's Gospel. And if so, then that would suggest that John's Gospel is written in a context after AD 70. The idea is that sometime after 80, perhaps in the 90s, Christians were being expelled from the synagogue. Now think about John chapter 9, where the man whose sight is restored by Jesus is put out of the synagogue. This has been a passage that for a long time has been considered to date John's Gospel to the 90s, because this man is put out of the synagogue. The problem with this is, we've said before, is that Christians were put out of the synagogue all through the 1st century, and not only at the end. And then the writing of the benedictions, the 18 benedictions, that includes the 12th benediction calling a curse on the Nazarenes, that is the followers of Jesus, and other heretics, is uncertain. We just don't know the date of that. And earlier, a few decades ago, scholars thought that it was to be dated from the 90s. It may well be, but we don't really know. The major issue, though, is that it's quite clear that Christians were put out of the synagogue right from the time of Jesus. So John chapter 9 is not reflecting a later date, but it's actually reflecting what actually took place in Jesus' time and ministry. This man was put out of the synagogue. If John knew the synoptics, then the date for John needs to be after the synoptic Gospels. And we've seen some reason to suspect that maybe Matthew and Luke were written after AD 70. Again, those dates are uncertain, but we want to put John after the synoptics if he knew them. Andreas Kostenberger has said that John wrote in regard to and in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. A new purification and a temple, that is Jesus, a reinterpretation of Jewish festivals around Jesus, and a new Passover sacrifice in Jesus, in his death, are what John is writing about in so much of the gospel. So that perhaps reflects the need to write about these things after the actual destruction of the temple. Now let's turn to the question of provenance. And we've seen that the Johannine writings do hang together by the kinds of things that are said. Even if the name John isn't to be found in the epistles, even if the name John isn't to be found in the Gospel of John, as it is in the book of Revelation, nevertheless, the writing is so similar. And even if we were to say that different authors were writing this, we would suggest that those authors somehow know each other and are living about the same time because they are presenting Christian theology using similar language. And so that leads us then to say that the indication from Revelation 1 through 3 is that these writings come from the Roman province of Asia, where the book of Revelation clearly originates. And so in that regard, what we can say is that John's Gospel represents a translation of the narrative of Jesus' ministry and death for the Jewish Gentile context of Asia Minor. I'm using the language of translation here as missiologists use it. Missiologists talk about how the gospel is to be proclaimed in an understandable way to other cultures, as well as raise the question, how is the gospel to be contextualized in other cultures? And there are different views about contextualization. Some views are extreme. They talk about syncretism, mix Christianity with native religious ideas in order to present it in a new culture and context. But the language of translation has been used to say that no, it's not the changing of the gospel or the mixing of the gospel ideas, but rather that the gospel can be translated into terms that a different culture can understand. It seems to me that this is what's going on in John's gospel. While John is representing the history, he is representing the words of Jesus, nevertheless, he is also engaged in translation for a different place and time. And we see that translation as, for example, we move from the language of kingdom to the language of life in John's Gospel. What would it mean to read John's Gospel as a response to the context of writing in the Roman province of Asia, where the 7 churches of Revelation 2 and 3 were situated? John's Gospel certainly reads differently from the Synoptics. We know that there were many Jews in Asia, and that they would have been eager to hear any reflection on what the destruction of the temple would mean for them, just as much as those living in Judea and Galilee would have been concerned. So that might be one aspect of the translation. Now the focus is going to be on presenting Jesus in light of the end of the temple. But we can push further. We can say, what about the Gentiles? How might they have heard John's story of Jesus in Asia, or anywhere in the Greek and Roman world for that matter? And so that question raises an interesting discussion in some of the commentaries about Jesus and the Greek god Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine, fertility, and new life. His name in the Roman context was Bacchus. It's the same god. Now, some scholars have suggested that John intentionally tells parts of the story of Jesus in reference to the story of Dionysus. You may recall that the Asian city of Pergamum had a temple dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and new life. And we also read some things about Dionysus that are interesting in light of John's Gospel. Pausanias says that 3 pots are brought into the building by the priests and set down empty in the presence of the citizens and of any strangers who may chance to be in the country. The doors of the building are then sealed by the priests themselves and by any others who may be so inclined. On the morrow, they are allowed to examine the seals. So the seals are still intact. And then on going into the building, what do they find in those pots that had been filled with water? They find that the pots are filled with wine. The god of wine has produced wine. Lucian says in his history, Dionysus makes rivers taste of wine. And Pliny says in his natural history, as well as Diodorus Siculus in his history, that springs produce wine on the days that celebrate the god Dionysus' appearance. Also, Achilles Tatius talks about how Dionysus visits a herdsman who can only offer him water as vines did not exist. And then what happens is that the drink becomes wine, and they dance for joy. Dionysus then shows him the vine that produces the wine. Is this why John includes the story of Jesus turning water into wine? Is this possibly why John records Jesus saying that he is the vine and his disciples are the branches in John chapter 15? Such a reading of the text would make sense to Christian believers in Pergamum, for example, one of the cities of Asia, where there was this temple to Dionysus. Of course, the stories of Dionysus would have been known far and wide, and not just in Pergamum. Something is also said about Dionysus' origins in the ancient myths. A divine son of Zeus and a mortal mother, Semele, produced him, and Dionysus is called twice born. In one story of his birth, he is still a fetus and survives his mother's death. And what Zeus, the father, does is he plants the fetus of Dionysus into his thigh and gives him birth. In another story, Dionysus, as a boy, is born from Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, and is then torn to shreds. But Zeus places his heart in Semele, from whom he is then born a second time. In another story about Dionysus, we hear how he descended to the underworld and brought his human mother back to life, sharing his immortality with her. Is this why we find in John's Gospel an emphasis on the theme of new life? Dionysus was also said to have worked miracles. With events like these, Apollodorus says, and in reference to the miracles of Dionysus during his earthly wanderings, with events like these, men learned that Dionysus was a god, and they began to honor him. So people hearing that Christians worshipped someone named Jesus might well expect that he was someone who traveled around like Dionysus, worked miracles, and was considered to be a god. Dionysus' life involved various exploits, which, moreover, culminated in his ascension to heaven, having proved through these exploits that he was indeed divine. While various comparisons might be made to Dionysus, then, it seems best to me not to approach this, as some scholars have, as if John has been influenced by these stories, or even presents Jesus in light of these stories, but rather that what John is doing is he is presenting who Jesus really was historically for an audience that needed to hear this kind of contrast with the myths that they had been telling about the gods. In other words, I'm opposed to the idea that the author is, in an extreme way, inventing stories that compare to what Dionysus did. You'd have to say then that the miracles of the synoptic gospels that have nothing to do with Dionysus somehow are presented for that reason as well, but rather there's far too much going on with miracles in the ancient Near East as well as in the Greco-Roman world to limit it to some comparison with the Greek and Roman teachings on the gods and their miracle working. Rather, to me, what's going on here is the best thing to do is to put on the mindset of the audience in Asia and hear the Gospel of John as if you were someone living in the first century who had become a Christian and perhaps even once in your past worshipped someone like Dionysus. And then these contrasts really come alive in a new way. Now, what can we say about authorship? Well, the internal evidence should be looked at first, and there is an interesting relationship between the author, the beloved disciple, and some anonymous disciple in the Gospel of John. Again, the Gospel of John does not mention John by name as the author. Have a look at this slide. We can see the relationship between the author, the anonymous disciple, and the beloved disciple. John 20, 2 through 3 says, "So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple." So this is some anonymous disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. All right, so there you have the beloved disciple. And said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. In John 13:23 we read, "One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him." And then in John 21, 1 through 2, we read, "After these things Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way." Now note the names of the disciples here. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, so that would be James and John, and two others of his disciples. Now we have an interesting anonymous two disciples here in John 21. We also had an anonymous two disciples in John chapter 1, although one of them gets named, which leaves one anonymous disciple in John chapter 1 who had been disciples of John the Baptist. So in this way, John begins his gospel with two anonymous disciples, one of whom becomes named, and then ends it with two anonymous disciples who remain anonymous in John 21. Notice also that the anonymous disciples of John 1 and 21 could not be John the son of Zebedee. Now, the beloved disciple appears several times. He's at the Last Supper, as we've just seen in John 13. He takes Jesus' mother at the cross. He sees blood and water flow from Jesus' side at the cross. He goes to the empty tomb with Peter, as we've just seen, and he writes or is involved with writing this gospel. We learn from John chapter 21. Now, one thing to say about the author, and this is really the most important thing to say about the author, as opposed to his identity as John, is that he is an eyewitness. John 21, 20 and 24 say, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, and he was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" Verse 24, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." Now that may be an addition to the gospel where the community or someone in the community is speaking of the author, We know that his testimony is true, or it could be just the way in which the author himself writes, identifying himself as an anonymous disciple, but as a disciple whose testimony is true. He is one who has been with Jesus through his ministry. He was an eyewitness. What can we say about the external evidence? Well, from the 2nd century, Irenaeus says in his work Against Heresies that John, the disciple of the Lord, who leaned on his breast, also published the gospel while living at Ephesus in Asia. So there also we have an identification with Asia. That's the Roman province of Asia. And this is said by Irenaeus to be something that he knew from Bishop Polycarp, who was put to death in his old age in AD 155. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna in Asia, who also had met John during his younger years. Now there's a complicating factor as we look at the authorship. And while I want to emphasize that authorship is not a crucial issue for us, it is nevertheless interesting to explore this to some extent. And so without getting bogged down too much, I want to look a little bit further at the question of authorship. Again, the primary point that we need to make about authorship of the Gospel of John is that it is written by an eyewitness. Now, there were 2 disciples of Jesus named John. This is the complicating factor for us. So while we would automatically think of John the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, we learn from Papias, writing in the early part of the 2nd century A.D., that there were 2 named John. He says, "If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I inquired into the sayings of the elders." And now notice the names he gives, and these are names that are clearly the names of the disciples of Jesus that we're familiar with from the Synoptic Gospels. What Andrew or what Peter or John or Matthew or any of the other of the disciples of the Lord had said. But then he says, "And the things which Aristion and the elder John, the disciples of the Lord, were saying." So there are 2 Johns, and both are disciples. Just that the John the son of Zebedee is one of the 12 disciples, as the Synoptic Gospels speak of them. And then there's this other John who was a disciple, an eyewitness of Jesus. So as to authorship, we can talk about a traditional view, the view that the church has basically held, and no doubt you came to this course believing too, that the Gospel of John was written by John, the disciple, the son of Zebedee. Now, the argument for this is rather simple. It's that the synoptics see Peter, James, and John as favorite disciples. And in John's Gospel, Peter is clearly distinguished from this beloved disciple, as in the text we've just read earlier, where, for example, they are both at the tomb. Now, one of these 3 in the inner circle of Jesus is James, John's brother, and we learn that he was martyred very early on from Acts chapter 12, verse 2. So this leaves John. The ending of John's Gospel suggests that John lived a long time, and so it could not have been James. Therefore, the argument goes it was John. And then, after all, we have the external evidence from authors in the second part of the 2nd century saying it is John, the son of Zebedee. Now, it seems to be John, the son of Zebedee, but let's explore this further. One author among many who would support the traditional view is Craig Keener, who's written one of the most exhaustive commentaries on the Gospel of John. He takes this view. But there are other views. There's David Catchpole, for example, who says and this is my having a little tempted humor at this point in the course finally. I'm not sure I give a fig, but I rather thought it might be Nathaniel, or Martin Hengel, the great backgrounds scholar from Germany. Vielleicht ist der Autor der alte Johannes. What Martin Hengel is saying is he believes it's not John the son of Zebedee, but it's the elder John. And Richard Bauckham is agreeing with him. I have to say that Martin has a jolly good case. It was John the Elder. Jim Charlesworth has suggested that it was Thomas. I doubt we'll ever know, but maybe it was Thomas. And Mark Stibbe says, I'd like to raise the thought that it was Lazarus. Okay, well, back to a more serious moment. The case for Lazarus, I think, is just far too weak, although it has been suggested by others than just Mark Stibbe. It is explicitly said that Jesus loved him, chapter 11, 3 and 5. So is he the beloved disciple? Also, the beloved disciple is first mentioned in the narrative after the raising of Lazarus, chapter 13, verse 23. He would have been in a position to take Jesus' mother to his own home at Bethany, nearby Jerusalem, chapter 19, verse 27. It would be uniquely appropriate, furthermore, if he were the one to recognize the significance of the placing of Jesus' clothes in the tomb, as we have in chapter 20, verses 6 through 8. And then finally, since he had already died once, it would make sense that he would be the object of the rumor that he would not die again, chapter 21, verse 23. The case not argued by, but presented by Andrew Lincoln in his commentary on John's Gospel. Well, there is a crucial issue that undermines the case for Lazarus. John chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. How, Lincoln asks, could one whom the chief priests wanted to kill have had access to the high priest's court? Now, we haven't ruled out yet that John, the son of Zebedee, might have been the author, but let's consider another suggestion. And this is a very intriguing hypothesis. It's presented by not only Martin Hengel and Richard Bauckham, but some others as well. For example, Ben Witherington takes this position. He suggests that it is the other John from Asia, the other John from Ephesus, the John known as John the Elder, who was also an eyewitness, disciple of Jesus' ministry. We've seen that Papias mentions two disciples named John. And in John 18:15 we read, Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Well, here we have the anonymous disciple mentioned with Peter, like at the death, although there at the tomb he's also referred to as the one who leaned on Jesus' breast. So who is this other disciple, this anonymous disciple? Now, does it make sense that it was Lazarus? We've already said no. But furthermore, does it make sense that he was John, the son of Zebedee, from Galilee? How would that person have had access to the high priest's court? That is an intriguing question. Now, what Bauckham suggests, and this is certainly on its own not a very strong argument at all, but he suggests that possibly the John of Acts 4, 5, and 6 could be this person. The next day their rulers, elders, and scribes assembled in Jerusalem with Annas the high priest, Caiaphas, John, and Alexander, and all who were of the high priestly family. All right, so there is a John who does have access to the high priestly court because, after all, he is from the high priestly family. But can we say more about that? Eusebius tells us something about someone named Polycrates living in the late part of the 2nd century A.D. Polycrates, in a letter to Victor of Rome, says, "And moreover, among those who have fallen asleep in Asia, there was Philip and his 3 daughters, and John, too. He leant back on the Lord's breast, who was a priest wearing the sacerdotal plate." The Greek word is patetlolon. That's the high priestly headdress. And then he says of him, he was both a martyr and a teacher. What an intriguing comment from someone who himself was from Asia, Polycrates. About 100 years after the gospel would have been written, that here we had a priest who leant on Jesus' breast, and his name was John. Could this be John the Elder? And in the Apostolic Constitution, 746, we see that John was appointed by John the son of Zebedee, and he was 2nd bishop of Ephesus after Timothy. So this elder John was considered at a later time in the early church to have been the 2nd bishop of Ephesus, obviously reading the language of bishop back into the time of Paul and Timothy, but nevertheless attesting to him as connected with John the son of Zebedee and connected with Ephesus in Asia. So Baucham's position is that the author is John the Elder. He was a Jerusalem disciple who hosted the Last Supper. After all, would John the son of Zebedee have had a place to host the Last Supper? But would not the one who Jesus is seated next to have been the one who owned the upper room? And that's why he's seated next to him. Jesus leant on his breast because they recline at table when they celebrate the Lord's Supper. So the host is right beside Jesus. Okay, so Baucham says this is the person who has written this gospel, and he was an eyewitness who gave testimony to Jesus. In the 2nd century, the authorship of the gospel came to be attributed to John, the disciple, the son of Zebedee, since the names of John and John were easily confused. The 12, of course, were given the highest authority in the church. So why not say it's John the son of Zebedee? Now, the idea then that it is John the Elder and not John the disciple, the son of Zebedee, is not a huge difference for us because both of them are eyewitnesses who can testify to the things that Jesus has done. This could explain issues about the comparison of Jesus to the festivals. This could explain why so much of John's gospel takes place in Jerusalem and not up in Galilee, and perhaps some other reasons too. I'm not going to come down on my own position on this. I just think it's an intriguing possibility that should not be ruled out. Baucham argues that the author is anonymously inserted at the beginning and the end of the gospel. As I mentioned earlier, we have the anonymous disciples in John 1 and then the anonymous disciples in John 21. And he says the purpose of this is to show that the author, who is the anonymous disciple, is present from beginning to end, so the eyewitness testimony can be trusted. We should also say something about authorship in the Spirit. The kind of conversation that I've just been presenting to you among scholars is a conversation very much at the human level. And nevertheless, there is a divine discussion to have about authorship. And with John's Gospel, this kind of conversation takes place with respect to the role of the Spirit in the community. I've got a few comments to make about this. First of all, from D. Moody Smith in his Theology of the Gospel of John. He says that the Spirit Paraclete continues and interprets the ministry of Jesus himself, and thus is appropriately called in John 14, 15, and 16 another Paraclete. The Spirit is Jesus' successor in this sense of Jesus' abiding presence with his disciples. Now, how will the Spirit not only bear witness to Jesus, John 15:26, but also tell the disciples things that they cannot yet bear, John 16, verse 12? Moody Smith suggests that the Spirit expounds to them the truth he already represented as it is appropriate for their own time, chapter 16, verses 13 through 15. At various points in John, we read that later the disciples will remember and understand what Jesus said or did. So the Spirit, on the one hand, brings things to mind, but on the other hand, also interprets what took place to a deeper level. And Moody Smith continues, what will the Spirit do? The giving of the Spirit to the disciples after Jesus has been resurrected in John 20, verse 22, stands between Jesus sending the disciples out in mission, verse 21, and granting them binding and loosing authority, verse 23. So Moody Smith says, the Spirit is taken for granted as inspiring and in guiding both the mission to the world and inner church life. And then finally, Moody Smith says that all four Gospels tie together Jesus' baptism with his receiving the Spirit and his being the one to baptize in the Spirit. Now, a second comment comes from Richard Bauckham's book again, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He says that the role of the Spirit may be more directly tied to the eyewitness testimony of the disciples in John, rather than a general statement about the Spirit's role in the community. So he's saying what's said about the Spirit has to do with the disciples more than the role of the Spirit in the Christian community, the church. And he references John 15:26 to 27. When the Advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who comes from the Father, he will testify on my behalf. You also are to testify because you have been with me from the beginning. So the Spirit of truth is abiding in the eyewitness disciples who bear testimony to Jesus. Well, that said, I think that we might want to go back more to Moody Smith's thoughts and say that while what Bauckham says might be true, it is also what Moody Smith was saying about the role of the Spirit in the Christian community. So to make this point, I want to have a few comments here about the Spirit and early Christian prophecy. We too easily skip over the role of prophets in the early church, and yet a careful reading of the New Testament will identify that the early church had prophets in it, continuing prophecies in the early church. The prophets in the church in Asia included Silas, who was involved with Paul on his second missionary journey, and in Acts 15, verse 32, we learn that Silas was one of the prophets from Jerusalem. And then John, the author of the Apocalypse, identifies his writing as a prophecy in chapter 1. And then we also have Philip with his daughters who are living in Caesarea in Acts 21, verses 7 through 8. His daughters, his four daughters there, are said to be prophetesses. And then what we know from early church history and you may remember from an earlier lecture, is that Philip and at least two of his daughters relocated to Hierapolis in Asia, in the province of Asia, very near to Laodicea. And so here we have some other prophets in Asia in the first century, about the time of the writing of John's Gospel, John's letters, and the Apocalypse. Paul writes in his letter that we call to the Ephesians, a letter that we can at least say was directed to churches in Asia, that the household of God is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And when he mentions those ministering in the church, he mentions first of all apostles and prophets, and then he adds evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So again, the prophets are mentioned here. So we have the idea that the early church community was a community of the Spirit. So continuing that thought, the church was a community of the Spirit who continued to speak through the Christian prophets. This was prophetic speech. Let's not despiritualize it and call it preaching. It was prophetic speech, and there is no indication that the church would cease to be a community of the indwelling presence of God's Spirit. Furthermore, John depicts the Christian community as a community of the Spirit, even if, as Bauckham suggests, a major point might well be that the eyewitnesses of Jesus are the ones with the Spirit's testimony of Jesus. Now I turn to look at the subject of structure. And looking at the structure of John's Gospel, particularly the first 12 chapters, is very informative for understanding what is being said in John's Gospel. Structure is one way that Gospel writers move from reporting the events to interpreting Jesus' life and message. And just as one simple example, look at how the feeding of the 5,000 is handled in Matthew 14 and in John 6 in different ways. The story, the event, is told in a very similar way, but the interpretation is different. What goes beyond just the event in Matthew's Gospel is a further teaching of Jesus to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples are at first confused, and they think Jesus is talking about bread and needing to take bread with them. But what Jesus is saying is beware of the teaching of the Pharisees, which then leads us to understand the feeding of the 5,000 as not just a miracle of feeding, but also an example of a concrete example of how Jesus will provide the right teaching for the disciples, represented by the 5,000 who are following Jesus. Jesus will give them the food that they need in his teaching. And now John takes the meaning of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6 in a direction that interprets Jesus' death. He says, you must eat my body and drink my blood. So the feeding of the 5,000 points to what Jesus' death meant. And when John reports the feeding of the 5,000, he says it's about the time of Passover that this takes place. So the idea of Passover is also connected to the feeding of the 5,000 in John's Gospel. So the Gospel writers don't just report, but they also interpret the stories, and they can interpret the meaning of Jesus' life and message in different ways. The only way to see this is to read more than just the particular story on its own, but to see how it fits into the larger context. And so we do need to look at structure. The overall structure of the Gospel of John is that there is a prologue in the first 18 verses, and there is an epilogue in the last chapter, chapter 21. Then we have the public ministry of Jesus with 7 signs that run from chapter 1, verse 19, all the way through the end of chapter 12. And then we have the private ministry of Jesus in the farewell discourses that are to be found in chapter 13:1 through the high priestly prayer of Jesus in chapter 17, verse 26. Note, by the way, how the end of the Gospel of John in chapter 20 states the reason for writing, and then there is a similar thing said at the end of the epilogue in John 21:25. We read John 20:30 through 31. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. And John 21:25 says, "But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So Jesus is the focus of the Gospel of John, and the reason for writing these things is that the readers might come to belief. Belief in what? In that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that those who do believe will obtain life in his name. Where paying attention to the structure of John's Gospel can be particularly interesting is in the public ministry part of John's Gospel, the first 12 chapters. And in them we find signs. Now there's some discussion about what are the 7 signs, but here is a typical listing of them. The turning of water into wine at Cana, the royal official's son at Capernaum. These are the only 2 that are numbered, first and second signs, and both of them take place in Cana. Then we have the invalid at the pool of Bethzatha, or Bethesda as we sometimes say, the loaves and fishes by the Sea of Galilee, the miracle at sea, the blind man in Jerusalem, and then the raising of Lazarus in Bethany from the dead. Now, the structure in this section can also be looked at in terms of episodes, where several stories are read together. And within them, we can find some of the signs, which is the middle column here. And the idea here is that within an episode you have some signs, but then some discourses that help to interpret the sign. Remember what I said earlier about the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, and then the subsequent dialogue that leads the reader of that miracle story, that sign story, to interpret it in terms of the Lord's Supper, in terms of Jesus' death and eating his body and drinking his blood. So that's chapter 6 there. So what I'm going to do is just run through these episodes as they've been suggested by someone several decades back now named C.H. Dodd. In The Interpretation of the Fourth Gospel, Dodd presents these episodes this way, and there are variations among scholars, so this is just one way of doing it, but I'm going back to one of the early suggestions of this and giving you that view. So he says, for example, in the first episode, we run from chapter 2, verse 1 through 4:42. In that, he says we have a theme of the new beginning in which the old things have passed and the new things have come, borrowing words from 2 Corinthians 5:17 to describe this. So what do we have? Well, we've got sign number 1, the miracle at Cana. Now notice immediately here that Dodd suggested that the cleansing of the temple should be considered the second sign. Not many would follow him on that. But uh, when Jesus does the miracle at Cana, he offers them new wine. And the water that is put into the jars of stone are put into jars that were for the purpose of purification. They had a religious purpose, as the text says. And so the water of cleansing is put into the purification jars, and Jesus turns it into a wine that represents blood at the Lord's table. And in this, then, he offers a new purification, not the purification that was required of cleansing by water in Jewish rituals, but a cleansing that goes far beyond that, a cleansing from Jesus himself. Then immediately we have Jesus cleansing the temple. So see how these stories are put together in order to teach something. And in the cleansing of the temple, Jesus' later dialogue is that he will replace the temple, destroy this body, and in 3 days it will be raised up. The understanding is that he's talking about destroying the temple, and he's actually talking about his body. Well, that understanding leads us to a deeper understanding that Jesus is replacing the temple as what will offer cleansing for the Jews. And then we have the story of Nicodemus. Well, in Nicodemus we have the language of new birth. And Jesus says you must be born from above. The Greek word is anothen. Now, anothen can also mean again. And so Nicodemus misunderstands Jesus and says, you mean I need to be born again in a physical way? But Jesus is talking about a new birth that is from above. And then in the story of the Samaritan woman and Jesus at the well, Jesus says, look, you've been coming here for centuries to get water from this well that Jacob had dug. But I'm going to give you a water that you'll never have to drink again, because it's a water that is a living water. And she says, give this to me to drink. And Jesus is talking about the Spirit. And so it's a new water. And he says, you will neither worship here, as you Samaritans do on Mount Gerizim, nor will we worship in Jerusalem anymore, but we will worship in spirit and in truth. All right, so looking at all of this together, there's a new beginning at Cana, there's a new beginning at the temple, there's a new birth, new beginning for Nicodemus, and there's a new beginning for the Samaritan woman personally, as well as for the Samaritans and for the Jews in terms of worship. Now, it may be that our first episode should include the last story in chapter 4, which is also a story about the new life that Jesus gives to the royal official's son when he comes to Cana to ask Jesus to heal his son back in Capernaum, and Jesus does. Maybe that also fits this perspective. So again, we can look at this differently. Some scholars will disagree on some aspects of this, but overall, the main point is read stories together in John's Gospel and you'll see that they fit a theme. Dodd suggests that the second episode can be spoken of in terms of the theme of the life-giving word. Christ is the giver of life. And he says that in this section we have 2 healings and 1 discourse. So he puts the healing of the nobleman's son in this second episode, along with the healing of the lame person at the pool of Bethesda or Bethzatha, in chapter 5, followed by a discourse that continues to interpret the signs. Part 1 has the theme God's perpetual activity, giving life and creating, is also part of Christ's activity. And this draws Jesus into the divine identity because he gives life and creates as well. Jesus performs divine work, but in complete obedience to the Father. And then part 2 is the theme of witness, coming in the last part of chapter 5. And so he argues these then hold together in terms of the life-giving word, theme of Jesus Christ. The third episode is all of chapter 6. We've already talked about it, how the theme is the theme of bread of life, and it begins with the feeding of the 5,000. And then that theme is developed in 3 stages, where Jesus begins talking about another feeding that took place in the history of the Jews, that is manna from heaven, and then the interpretation always coming back to Christ. So Jesus is the bread from heaven, is the interpretation, and then it intensifies as we move from the feeding of the Israelites in the wilderness to understand Jesus' new feeding of his disciples in terms of his body, his flesh and his blood. He is the bread and the giver of bread. So he gives himself, his flesh and his blood. The fourth episode comes in chapters 7 and 8. And you'll notice as you look at the scripture verses, what's missing is John 7:53 through 8:11, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Early manuscripts simply don't have that story. And if you read from John 7:52 and then pick up in 8:12, you won't miss that story at all. It has been inserted into the text and really is not part of the original Gospel of John. It's in a lot of manuscripts, but the better manuscripts lack that story. This fourth episode is called Light and Life, and it has to do with the manifestation and rejection of Jesus. This is how Dodd looks at it. We'll talk about this later in terms of the feasts and festivals that Jesus attends and how he interprets himself regarding them at a later point in this lecture. Now, what we have here then is a single festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, and we have several dialogues that take place. And it's helpful to know what actually took place at that Feast of Tabernacles in order to understand some of the things that Jesus is saying. But I won't go into the details of that just yet. Just note here that it's a single festival that binds chapters 7 and 8 together, and that the theme is the theme of light and life. The fifth episode has to do with judgment by the light, following on what we just read in chapters 7 and 8. And here we have the sign of the man born blind. Notice he has no light in his eyes. At the pool of Siloam, and Jesus heals him. And then there's a discourse on the theme of the shepherd and the flock, and an appendix, says Dodd, of Jesus is rejected by the Jews and most explicitly tells who he is. So the rejection shows that they are rejecting the light and therefore will come under judgment, whereas Jesus gives the light to someone like the man at the pool. The sixth episode, Dodd says, is that the victory of life over death. And here we have the story of Lazarus. So it's told, but then there's a further description of this. And the theme has to do with life, eternal life, to be enjoyed here and now, and then the resurrection life, which is for the future. So it's an already not yet perspective on the life that Jesus offers in light of this event of raising Lazarus from the dead. In the 7th episode, we have life through death, the meaning of the cross in chapter 12. And God says in verses 37 to 50 of chapter 12, we have an epilogue to the book of signs, which means if you read those verses, you'll get a sense of the essence of John's theology in this section of John's gospel, because he's summarizing what he wanted to say. Just as you will get the essence of what John wants to say in the prologue in chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. So the evangelist cements the story he has told, particularly in verses 44 to 50. It's a resume of the salient points of John's preaching. So let's read that section of John, chapter 12, verses 44 through 50, and notice what's in red. This is the Johannine theological language that we have come to learn by this point, and some of it's already been introduced in the prologue. Then Jesus cried aloud, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world, so that everyone who believes in me should not remain in the darkness. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my word has a judge. On the last day the word that I have spoken will serve as judge, for I have not spoken on my own, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment about what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I speak, therefore, I speak just as the Father has told me." You can compare that to earlier in the Gospel of John, John 1, 45 through 51. Then we have the private discourse of Jesus with his disciples that begins in chapter 13. Jesus' farewell address to his disciples. It comes in 3 parts in chapters 13 and 14. At the end of chapter 14, Jesus says, "Come, let's go from here." And you expect it all to be over, and yet in chapters 15 and 16, you get essentially the same thing that you found in chapter 14, repeated in different ways, as if the same story is being told again. But you get those 2 tellings that come to a climax in Jesus' prayer, his high priestly prayer, in chapter 17. We then get Jesus' passion and resurrection in chapters 18, 19, and 20, and then the epilogue that comes in chapter 21. Now there's some other points that can be made about structuring in John's Gospel that are quite interesting. And the next 2 slides will attend to these issues. The first has to do with the prologue, and then the second has to do with where the phrases "lifted up" and "I am" occur in John's Gospel. In Greek, syllables can be counted in the prologue in John 1, 1 through 18, and it will be discovered that they add up to 496 syllables. Now that happens to be a triangular number, and it's the 3rd perfect number in Greek, as Richard Bauckham has pointed out. But what is particularly interesting is that it is also the value of the word monogenes. We've talked about how you can count Greek letters because the alpha, for example, stands for 1 and the beta stands for 2 and so forth. And there are a couple other symbols introduced into this, the charts at the bottom here of the slide, that shows you how you would assign value for different Greek letters a numerical value for different Greek letters. And then any word then has a numerical value. The numerical value of the word monogenes is 496. Monogenes means that one and only, or something like that. It's sometimes translated as only begotten, but the idea of begotten really is not part of the idea in the word. So the one and only, it's as if you have, how many children do you have? Well, I've got one child, an only child, and because the child is the only child, all the parental love goes toward that one child. That's the idea of monogenes, the one and only beloved Son of God. And so this word appears in verse 18 and verse 14 of the prologue, and it is a word used of Jesus. Its value is 496, and lo and behold, the syllables in Greek in the prologue add up to 496. Is this just coincidence? Well, furthermore, we have the words of the Lord's Prayer, beginning in the middle of verse 1 where the prayer begins, all the way to the end, verse 26 of chapter 17. If we add up the words, not the syllables this time, we come to 486. And you discover that the Greek word pater, which means father, when you address the Father, pater, father, that word also adds up to 486, the prayer of Jesus to the Father. So it's just an intriguing thing. We don't learn anything dramatic, nothing about the theology beyond what is already stated without knowing the numerical value issue, but it does show the careful structuring in John's Gospel. Now, the next example does have a theological significance. What we have here on this slide, running horizontally in 3 boxes, is the phrase, lifted up. Notice John 3:14-15. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Notice the last box on the horizontal line, John 12:32-34. Here we learn that lifted up means crucified. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. But lifted up not only means lifted up physically on a cross, but it also means to be lifted up in glory, to be glorified. And so there's the double meaning in the word lifted up. Now notice the vertical boxes, beginning with John 4:26 and ending with John chapter 18, 5-6 and 8. Here we have a different word. It's actually the phrase I am, ego eimi in Greek. Now, in John 4:26, our first box, we actually have the phrase I am he. But the Greek doesn't say I am he. It simply says I am the one who is speaking to you. And what we can call this is the absolute use of the term I am. The non-absolute use might be other places in John's Gospel where, for example, Jesus says, I am the door, or I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. This is non-absolute. But here, in these boxes in the vertical column, we have only the absolute use of I am, despite whatever translation you're looking at. And this is the NRSV. So what Jesus is actually doing is he's using language that God used of himself. It's reminiscent of the revelation of God to Moses in Exodus 3. He reveals himself as the one who is. But also in Isaiah chapter 47 and verses 8 and 10, God reveals himself, and he says, I am, and there is no one beside me. The same phrase occurs in both verses 8 and 10 of chapter 47 in Isaiah. So what is said of God, that he has absolute existence in himself and there therefore is no one other than him, is now something that Jesus is using of himself. So Jesus in chapter 4 reveals himself as the I am to the Samaritan woman. Now, what's interesting here, and this is again something pointed out by Richard Bauckham, is that the very middle of the I am sections in John's Gospel is also the very middle of the lifted up sayings in John's Gospel, hence the cross shape here. Now, there's no reason to believe that John was thinking in terms of a cross, as is represented here, but he is thinking theologically in terms of the cross, because the lifted up sayings point to the cross, and the I am sayings point to God's identity. And what John is saying to us is that Jesus reveals the glory of the Father when he is lifted up on the cross. The glory of Jesus in being lifted up is also a revelation of the glory of God, because he shares the same identity as the I am. And what is so profound here, and totally unique to Christianity, is the idea that to understand God most intimately is to understand that he is the one who will suffer and die on the cross for the sake of a sinful people. He will take away the sins of the world himself, and in so doing he reveals his divine glory. This is an amazing statement that John is making, and he makes it not only in the words that are used in these verses, but also the way he structures them together. We've seen that kind of structuring and how many times divine names are used in the book of Revelation. Well, here we have it again in another way, in an amazing way, in John's Gospel. Within the first section of John's Gospel, in what some have called the Book of Signs, from 119 through 1250, Jewish festivals figure rather prominently. The next slide will show some of the festivals of Judaism, not all of them, and those festivals that may have a significance for interpreting John's Gospel. Here we have the festivals of Passover, or Pesach, of the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost as it's called, Shavuot, the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes it's called of Booths, it's Sukkoth, and then we have Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. Now, over in the final column of this table are references to John's Gospel, and the only one that we're not sure of is the Feast of Pentecost, or Weeks. We'll go through this with respect to these passages in John's Gospel and see the significance of the festival for what is said about Jesus in his revelation. Also on this table are about the times of the year that we can understand these festivals to take place, and the Old Testament background passages for them. So beginning with the Feast of Pentecost. Pentecost occurred 50 days after the Feast of Passover. And the Feast of Passover isn't a fixed day in terms of the calendar, but it happens round about April, as you know, because of its connection with Easter. So Pentecost then can come in May or possibly June. Pentecost was a harvest festival. Uh, it was an early harvest festival, and it would be also associated in Judaism with the giving of the law to Moses. A number of the festivals in the Old Testament have an ancient background in terms of the seasons of planting and harvesting and so on. But then they came to take on new meaning in the Old Testament as they were applied to the revelation of God to the people of Israel. And what we see in the Gospel of John is a reinterpretation yet again of those festivals with respect to Jesus. Now, in John 5, verse 1, we have an unnamed feast, and it is a feast that also takes place around Jesus healing somebody on the Sabbath day, verse 9 of chapter 5. So the question is John chapter 5 to be read with the festival in the background or simply with the Sabbath day in the background? Now, the Sabbath day is the day of going to synagogue and hearing the law of Moses read. The festival of Pentecost is associated with the giving of the law of Moses. So either way, whether it's Pentecost or Sabbath in view, we have a focus in the background on Jesus and the law. And so we see Jesus apparently breaking the Sabbath according to some interpretations of the Sabbath because he has done some work on the Sabbath. This is something we find also in the Synoptic Gospels, for example, in Matthew chapter 12. Now, in John 5:45 through 47, Jesus turns the argument around. Whereas the Jews are using the law of Moses as they interpret it to attack him because he's healed on the Sabbath, Jesus says, all right, if Moses is bearing witness on your behalf against me in this law court, let's bring him forward and see what he really says. And he says, what he really says is that he testifies on my behalf. So we read, do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom you have set your hope. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe what he wrote, how will you believe what I say? Another festival that's important for interpreting John's Gospel is the Feast of Tabernacles. And it is mentioned in John chapter 7, verse 2, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. John chapter 7 and John chapter 8 are a single event in the life and ministry of Jesus at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. What has confused people sometimes in the past is if they read the woman caught in adultery story as part of the original text of John's Gospel, and that kind of breaks it up. And you're not sure what to do with 8:12 and following. But if you take that passage out that was stuck in there by some later copyists, and you just read straight John chapter 7 and 8, you see that it is a single festival that's in view. Now, this festival is associated with drawing water at the pool of Siloam. And remember in John chapter 9, Jesus heals a blind man and sends him down to this pool of Siloam. For a long time, people were shown a pool that was called Siloam on the south side of Jerusalem. Still within Jerusalem, but right on the south side. Now, the picture here is of a pool that was excavated as recently as 2005. And a number of archaeologists think that this is actually the real pool of Siloam. It's a much larger pool than the one that was traditionally shown. and also it is very close to the other pool. Now, George Beasley Murray, in his commentary on John's Gospel, says the following about this particular festival, the Festival of Tabernacles, or Booths. At the break of day, priests processed from the temple to the pool of Siloam. There they filled a golden pitcher with water and bore it back to the temple. On approaching the water gate on the south side of the inner court, the shofar, or trumpet, was sounded 3 times, joyous blasts which were explicitly related to Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. The priests, bearing the water, then processed around the altar, watched by the pilgrims, while the temple choir sang the Hallel, that is, Psalms 113 to 118. Those psalms, by the way, were also sung at the time of Passover. When the opening words of Psalm 118 were reached, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord," every man and boy shook the lulab, which was a bunch of willow and myrtle tied with palm, shook the lulab with his right hand and held aloft citrus fruit in his left hand, which was a sign of the harvest gathered in. And the cry, "Give thanks to the Lord," was repeated 3 times. The same thing happened at the cry, "O Lord, save us," which comes in Psalm 118, verse 25. Since all this took place at the time of the daily offering, the water was offered to God in connection with the daily drink offering of wine. A chosen priest mounted the altar on which stood 2 silver bowls, one for the reception of the drink offering and the other for the water. When the priest had poured the wine and the water into their respective bowls, they were then poured out as offerings to God. The crowd then called out, "Lift up your hand!" The demand was made as a sign that the rite was properly fulfilled, since the Sadducees, that priestly group in Jerusalem, objected to the rite on the ground that it was not prescribed in the law of Moses. Accordingly, the priest had to raise his hand aloft to show that he had faithfully discharged his duty. Now, with that backdrop, let's read John 7:37 through 39, which is here on the slide. Remember, they go down to the pool of Siloam and bring water up, and then there's this drink offering. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now he said this about the Spirit which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. The passage just read from John chapter 7 has in verse 38 a quotation, it seems, from the Old Testament. Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. And yet, when you look into the Old Testament, you can't find any passage that has those words exactly. What often happens in Jewish interpretation is different texts are brought together to create an interpretation of the texts rather than a quotation of a singular text. And probably what's behind this is something like Zechariah 14, verses 8 through 9, a passage that might actually have figured during this festival as well. It reads, "On that day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will become king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one." The same idea, also using water imagery coming from the temple, is to be found in Ezekiel 47. So, for example, verse 1 reads, "Then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple. There water was flowing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east," for the temple faced east. "And the water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar." Later on, verse 9a says, "Wherever the river flows, every living creature that swarms will live." So we have this vision of water flowing from the temple, flowing from Jerusalem, flowing from the altar, that brings life to all that it touches. Now, Jesus seems to be associating this water with himself and then also with the believer's heart, out of which will flow the river of living water. So it's a very rich imagery. And what is practiced at the temple festival, the Festival of Tabernacles, is now being associated with Jesus, with his followers who receive the water that he is bringing. Remember various water passages earlier in John's Gospel, such as in chapter 4, at Jacob's well with the Samaritan woman. And then also eschatologically, that is, as Jews look toward the end times and what God would establish in the age to come. So now what Jesus is saying is, this age has arrived. What the festival pointed to is now here, because I am here giving you living water to flow from your heart. As we continue on to look at this festival, we move into John chapter 8, verse 12. Again Jesus spoke to them, saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Also, we've just looked at Zechariah 14. A passage read at the Feast of Tabernacles is Zechariah 14, verses 5 through 9. "Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there shall not be either cold or frost, and there shall be continuous day. It is known to the Lord. Not day and not night, for the evening time there shall be light. On that day," and here we get our living waters passage, living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and so forth. Now, as George Beasley Murray continues to point out about this festival of Sukkoth, according to the Mishnah that tells us about this festival from the 2nd century A.D., in the tractate Sukkoth 5, we read that 4 large lamps during the festival were lit in the court of women. At the end of the first day of the feast, and from other sources on the other days as well, people went down into the court of the women. Golden lamps were there, and 4 golden bowls were on each of them, and 4 ladders were by each. 4 young men from the priestly group of youths had jugs of oil in their hands containing about 120 logs, and poured oil from them into the individual bowls. Wicks were made from the discarded trousers of the priests and from their girdles. There was no court in Jerusalem that was not bright from the light of the place of drawing water. Men of piety and known for their good works danced before them, that is, before the crowd, with torches in their hands, and sang before them songs and praises. And the Levites stood with zithers and harps and cymbals and trumpets and other musical instruments without number on the 15 steps, which led down from the court of the Israelites into the court of the women, and which corresponded to the 15 songs of the steps in the Psalms. So here again we have not only the imagery of water, but the imagery of light. at the festival, and Jesus interpreting, or shall we say reinterpreting, each of those with respect to himself. We also have, on 3 occasions, the Feast of Passover. And particularly in John chapter 6, this Passover is interpreted, and Jesus interprets it with respect to himself. It begins with a reference that Jesus feeds the 5,000 about the time of Passover, and so there's our indication that Passover is the backdrop festival for what's to follow in John chapter 6. And Jesus then interprets the Passover rightly with respect to what happened to the Israelites in the wilderness. They ate manna from heaven. But then Jesus interprets this with respect to himself. He is the bread from heaven. And just as he has fed the multitude in the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, now the greater implication of that is Jesus is himself the bread that will feed the multitude. And as we read on in chapter 6, this becomes more and more concrete, to the point that people turn away from him. They're offended by what he says. That is, that they have to eat his flesh and drink his blood. His flesh is given for the life of the world, we read in verse 51. And he says, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." John 6:53. And that reminds us of what John the Baptist said, that Jesus is the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world. And it reminds us when we come to chapter 19, at another Passover, when Jesus is put to death, he is put to death on the day of preparation when the lambs are slain. Right about the time the lambs are slain, he himself dies on the cross. John 19:14 through 16. Another festival is a festival that's not to be found in the Old Testament, because it has to do with the rededication of the temple in the 2nd century BC. Remember how Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the ruler of Syria, the Seleucid king, desecrates the temple in 168 BC. And then the temple is rededicated in 164 BC as the Maccabees push back against the Syrians. And in Josephus' book, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 12, we read, "And when the king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples, and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day." This is the desolating sacrilege referred to several times in the book of Daniel. And so the rededication of the temple is such a great event in the life of Israel that it becomes a yearly festival, the festival of Hanukkah. Now, John chapter 10, verse 22 says, "At that time the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem, and it was winter." And we know that this festival takes place just before our Christmas time in December. So John chapter 10 has as the backdrop the festival of Hanukkah. The connections with the Feast of Hanukkah and what we read in John 10:22 through 39 are not as clear as what we saw in John 7 through 8. And yet perhaps we can say some things about the relationship between Hanukkah and the words of Jesus here. First of all, since this is a festival that reminds us of the story of Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the need for someone to come fight on Israel's behalf against this invading a non-Jewish pagan leader, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the idea of messiahship may well be in focus here. John 10, verse 24, the Jews gathered around him and said, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly." And so is Jesus going to be the one to bring them a resolution to this invading force that occupies God's land and controls God's people? No longer the Syrians and Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, but now the Romans. And then secondly, Jesus identifies himself with God. It's as if here at a festival that reminds Israel of a time when someone was called Epiphanes, someone who identified himself with God, was this invading foreign ruler that had to be overthrown or at least pushed back by the Jewish Maccabees. Now Jesus seems to create a new problem over identifying himself with God. And Jesus says in verses 30 and 31, "The Father and I are one." And so the Jews take up stones again to stone him for his blasphemy, his apparent blasphemy. And then thirdly, this is a festival to commemorate the Maccabean heroes who did manage to push Antiochus IV Epiphanes back and rededicate the temple just 3 years after the desolation of sacrilege took place. And so here these Maccabean heroes' good works are being commemorated, and Jesus speaks of his good works. He says in John 10:32, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me?" And then fourthly, over against the Jewish national identity that is commemorated at the Feast of Hanukkah, Jesus speaks of the sheep that the Father has given to him. It's not anyone who is a Jew that is in view in Jesus' ministry, but those sheep that the Father has given him. Jesus draws a distinction between the Jews and those who are his disciples. We've come now to the end of the lecture on John's Gospel, and we've also come to the end of lectures on the different books of the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament. So at this point, I want to bring to your attention some next steps for you in your own personal studies that go beyond this course. And I'd like to suggest just a few things very briefly. One is to pick up a more detailed New Testament introduction. The textbook that has been used in this course has been chosen for various reasons, and one of those is that it is short. And there are textbooks that are called New Testament Introduction that are going to give you much more detail. And that would be something worth having in addition to the excellent textbook that you had that focused on the backgrounds of the New Testament documents in particular, but also introduced you to the structure and issues of authorship and so forth. So one textbook along these lines is that fairly recently produced by David De Silva called An Introduction to the New Testament, Contexts, Methods, and Ministry Formation. It tries to engage not only in the questions of introducing the New Testament, but also to talk about how do you go about interpreting the New Testament. That's the methods part of the title. And furthermore, how can we read the New Testament for ministry formation? So it's a very long textbook that tries to cover quite a lot along these lines. There's also that by Don Carson, Doug Moo, and Leon Morris, An Introduction to the New Testament. These are written by evangelicals, and I could recommend both of them. Very good introductions to the New Testament. Another step that you might take is to explore more in Bible backgrounds if you're interested in that. And some of the more detailed scholarly commentaries would do that book by book. But one resource is that produced by Craig Keener. The IVP, that's the InterVarsity Press, the IVP Bible Background Commentary, and there's one for the Old Testament and one for the New Testament. This would be a next step if you want to go further with Bible backgrounds. And then thirdly, you might explore the New Testament use of the Old Testament further. This has been a feature of the lectures that I've given you, but there's so much more to do along these lines. And Greg Beale and Don Carson have edited a volume called A Commentary on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, where different scholars take each of the books of the New Testament and explore how the Old Testament has been used in those books. So these would be excellent next steps for you to consider. And there's one more I want to suggest to you.